Brene Brown is a professor of social work at the University of Houston, Texas, in the United States. She first rose to fame after a TED Talk she gave in 2013 went viral. The Power of Vulnerability has been viewed almost 50 million times to date, making it one of the top 5 most viewed YouTube videos of all time. In it, she talks about her theory of shame, which she summarizes from a research paper she published in an academic journal in 2006. It is entitled Shame Resilience Theory, a grounded theory study on women and shame. To quickly paraphrase, shame resilience is recognizing and acknowledging shame when we feel it and then reaching out to others and communicating shameful feelings with the end goal of building communal awareness and empathy around the underlying issues. At the point in time that she published her underlying theory, she says she did not study men. Over the years, other studies on human emotion have attracted criticism if they don't represent both sexes, and later in her career, Dr. Brown acknowledged that shame is organized by gender. After the publication of her paper in 2006, she did begin to study men, but she hasn't formally published any update in an academic journal, though she often refers to her research on men in her work. When she does, it is most likely in the form of anecdotal evidence. The question I seek to answer here is how men fit into her shame resilience theory today, and has she been successful at incorporating men in her original theory? Specifically, has she been successful at accounting for the sex differences that men and women process shame with? My conclusion, as you will see, is no, she doesn't. The following is a step-by-step explanation of what is missing and what needs to be included in a theory of shame that accounts for all sexes and genders. In The Power of Vulnerability, she gives an overview of some of the ideas that inspired her 2006 paper. Shame is really easily understood as the fear of disconnection. Is there something about me that if other people know it or see it, that I won't be worthy of connection, she asks? For Brown, the opposite of shame is human connection, a feeling of belonging. Examples she gives of shame are, I'm not thin enough, rich enough, beautiful enough, smart enough, promoted enough. She says in her research she could divide people into 2 camps, representing people who handled shame pretty well and those who didn't. I roughly took the people I interviewed and divided them into people who really have a sense of worthiness, a strong sense of love and belonging, and folks who struggle for it. The people who have a strong sense of love and belonging believe they're worthy of love and belonging. That's it. They believe they're worthy. One question I asked myself after hearing this was, is it the same for men? Sure, a feeling of belonging within a community is important for men, but in terms of how belonging relates to shame, is it identical for men and women? For example, I'm not thin enough or beautiful enough. Well, sure, I could lose a couple of pounds and I wouldn't mind looking like a movie star, but am I ashamed of my appearance? Does it affect my sense of belonging in the way that a surprising number of women report it does? No, it doesn't. And while some men might be more self-conscious than me, the fact is, women are far more likely than men to suffer from anxiety disorders that require psychiatric care. Typically, they revolve around their appearance and social status. Shame is quite frequently a central component in these kinds of anxiety disorders. Brown does not mention any sex differences at all in her first wildly popular TED Talk. However, in a later TED Talk entitled Listening to Shame, she talks about shame being organized by gender. There is an overwhelming amount of evidence that this is true. If we look to the neurosciences, for instance, we find that there are clear sex differences in how shame is processed and responded to. But Brown never talks about any of that evidence, so what exactly does she mean when she says that shame is organized by gender? She says, for women, shame is do it all. Do it perfectly, never let them see you sweat. It is a web of unattainable, conflicting expectations of who we're supposed to be. Well, in my mind, that helps to explain why women suffer more from anxiety disorders. But how about men? For men, Brown says, shame is do not be perceived as weak. Really? That's it? All shame is for men is don't be perceived as weak? Weakness is certainly one thing it is possible for men to feel ashamed about, but what about this guy? And this guy? And this guy? And this guy? The fact is, male shame is vastly more complex for men than simply being perceived as weak. But we never hear any of these complexities. I have read through most of Dr. Brown's work, and frankly, men in Brene Brown's work are often portrayed as, well, two-dimensional, a caricature. Nowhere in her work have I been able to find any sense of the emotional complexity that can be found in the human male. Very often I get the sense that Brown regards a lot of men as defective women, at least in their emotional lives. Brown says men have two switches when it comes to shame, pissed off and shut down. I think what she is speaking of is the likelihood that when men are confronted with something shameful, they have a tendency to shrug it off, ignore it, not let it get to them, and if possible, simply change the subject and forget about it. Why? Well, frankly, because it often works, and people generally do what works best for them. That's just human nature. That is not how she portrays men, though. To her, shrugging it off seems to be a flaw which she attributes to faulty cultural conditioning. She says, we put men in a box and teach them that they have to be all-powerful, making an analogy to the famous scene in The Wizard of Oz when Dorothy's dog Toto pulls the curtain aside to reveal a little man with a microphone and a loudspeaker. Really? That applies to all men? We're all taught to be like the Wizard of Oz? This seems to me to be highly reductive. I don't think all men are like the Wizard of Oz. I actually believe that today that particular comparison applies to a very small percentage of men rather than the majority she implies. As I mentioned, Brown began researching men and shame later in her career after her paper. In her audiobook, Men, Women, and Worthiness, she describes her research on men and shame. When she started on her research, she told her graduate students, before we go out in the field, here is what you will hear. Number 1, sports analogies. Number 2, stories from high school. Number 3, the word P-U-S-S-Y. It's a word that came up over and over in the data, she says. Pussy? She explains that after interviewing hundreds of men, her research came down to the conclusion that shame for men means don't be a pussy. Sports analogies, primarily football, are the context that she most often associates with the word pussy. To paraphrase, she says that men feel that they need to exhibit violence in order to feel belonging with other men. Otherwise, they will be viewed as weak and be excluded. She says that men are taught that they need to be violent in order to feel belonging. After interviewing hundreds of men, is this all she learned about men and shame as opposed to women? And the answer is, well, yes, that's about it. At some point, she says that men told her a few other things like shame is failure, shame is being wrong, shame is being defective, but she doesn't develop any of these ideas. What she develops is showing fear and being soft as being the main drivers of male shame. To this I have to say, not all men even like football, and not all men are worried even slightly about being perceived as effeminate if they are not violent or, as she says, being branded as a pussy. In our day and age, men, as well as women, come in all shapes and sizes, and her claims about men are, at best, incomplete. With 5 best-selling books related to the topic and one of the most popular YouTube videos of all time, Brown is clearly the most famous person in the world connected with the subject of shame. Next to Harvey Weinstein, of course. How does it come about that she is not better able to acknowledge clear sex differences in how shame is processed and responded to? Like many issues in our lives today, I think it has to do with the great political divide. Sex differences in anything having to do with human psychology are ferociously contested, particularly in academic environments, and I'm sure the University of Houston, where Brown teaches, is no different. If men and women are truly different emotionally, so the argument goes, then there must be some biological component, meaning the differences evolved over millions of years, suggesting that, well, if it's part of human nature, then we should just accept it. This idea does not sit well with many progressive-minded academics who feel that the explanation lies much more in our cultural conditioning. And if any difference exists between men and women, it is a result of this conditioning, very often referred to as the patriarchy, and therefore something that can be quickly modified. These opposing ideas are known generally as the nature-nurture debate, which has been an ongoing preoccupation in academic circles and beyond for the past several decades. However, very recent advances in the neurosciences are making it more and more difficult by the day to argue for strict cultural conditioning as an explanation for sex differences in emotions like shame. Researchers have not only been able to pinpoint differing neural networks by which emotions are processed in men and women, but also differences in the actual physical apparatus by which these processes are carried out. I am speaking in particular about the human brain's limbic system and other areas in the central nervous system associated with emotional processing. We know that men and women process emotions differently. We know that men and women use different parts of the brain to process different emotions. And we know that different amounts of different hormones are very often involved with processing different emotions depending on sex. These findings have received a lukewarm reception at best. Quite frankly, Brene Brown's socially progressive audience does not appear to feel the absence of a biological explanation for human sex differences, nor do they seem to mind men's sex differences being presented to them as a sort of caricature. From reading reviews of her work on places like Amazon and Goodreads, it appears that most of her readers are happy with the idea that men's shameful feelings tend to revolve around violence and sports, and that women's anxieties about their appearance are due to social conditioning revolving around the idea of an oppressive patriarchy. In short, I think the best explanation for the shortcomings in Brown's work on sex differences comes about as a result of her being able to count on a very positive reception for those shortcomings among her audience, her readership, and her colleagues in the Graduate School of Social Work. In the great nature-nurture debate, which has raged on for the past half-century or so, people tend to stand by their convictions, meaning it's very difficult to win converts to either side. In my next video, I'm going to try to do just that. I'll be taking a closer look at Brown's shame resilience theory and explaining why it works so well for a lot of women and less so for a lot of men. My website is www.shameandshaming.com. It contains a lot more information about shame and shaming in the 21st century, as will my forthcoming book by the same title. Please be sure to like my video and subscribe, as well as contribute to the comments section. See you in my next video.